So I was born with a unique sight that I didn't know I had. I wasn't close to my family. I didn't have close friends. Um, but when I was 7, I had what I considered to be a visitation. And I came from a very poverty stricken family, a lot of alcohol, a lot of drug abuse, and church was not our thing. And I had this amazing mist start to come through the wall. And I fell to my knees, not because I was scared, but the serenity was so amazing. And I heard a voice say 3 things to me. Hi, I'm Patti Conklin, and I'm really grateful to talk to you tonight about your superior self.
Ooh, I like it. Patty, thank you for taking the time. I love that piece of art behind you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. And this beautiful piece of art, cut off a little bit at the top, but it's one that Richard Sutphin painted. Most people know him as the man who found Sedona, reincarnation, New York Times bestseller, craft of many trades, really dealing a lot with vortexes and reincarnation, hypnosis, and so forth. And he was a master at it, but he was also an incredible painter. And so one day when I was at his place in California, I climbed up into his warehouse, and I started coming across all these paintings. And I'm like, "What are these?" And he's like, "Oh, I painted those, blah blah blah." And I started going up the ladder and taking them down and putting
Really?
them in a shipping container to send them to Georgia.
I
So
love that one. I love that piece.
it's a beautiful piece.
I can't believe you wanted to have it like fuzzy. I think that's such a beautiful piece of art.
It's a beautiful piece of art for people who are like, where is she? I'm in a houseboat, and we don't really have even doors in here, and the boat's kind of rocking tonight, but at least the picture stays up. I'm
It
always
starts going
grateful
like
about
this.
that. Exactly. You'll know we're really rocking and rolling in here.
When the boats are rocking, don't come a knock.
That's right.
So Patty, let's talk more about your bio, right? Like medical intuitive. Like that's so fascinating to me. How did it start for you, like this path, this journey?
Wow, it's a loaded question. Um, so I was born with a unique sight that I didn't know I had. I wasn't close to my family. I didn't have close friends. Um, but when I was 7, I had what I considered to be a visitation. And I came from a very poverty stricken family, a lot of alcohol, a lot of drug abuse, and church was not our thing. And I had this amazing mist start to come through the wall. And I fell to my knees, not because I was scared, but the serenity was so amazing. And I heard a voice say 3 things to me. 38 to 42 will be your greatest growth years. 42 to 62 will be your greatest contribution to humanity. And the purpose of your walk is to teach people to become insubstantial without transitioning. And I was fairly precocious at 7, but I didn't know what that meant. Um, but as I continued on with life, I kind of set out on my own when I was 12 and finished high school when I was 16, graduated early. And I really began understanding that I didn't see the world the way other people saw it. And I don't know if you remember Carl Sagan,
Mm-mm.
but Carl Sagan was a astrophysicist and at Cornell. And my then husband was there. And Carl kept saying to me, "You're not normal. You're not normal. You're seeing the world in a way we don't see it." And so finally, when I was 28, I was tested and found that I had a genius IQ, but that my brain waves were extensively faster than a normal human. And it allows me to see particles. It's my world 24/7. I see particles. And so everything's in grayscale. I can tell you something's blue. I can tell you something's red, but I would never be able to tell you the shades of those colors. And so, I'd always worked in nonprofit. My first big job was overseeing women's literacy programs in 30 countries throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Took many nonprofit jobs through those years. And right before I turned 38, I had another visitation and was told to take my family to Hartwell, Georgia, and fully begin walking the path was asked to walk as a child.
Hmm.
And that was it. We didn't need major marketing. We didn't need anything. The small town of Hartwell, Georgia, a couple of thousand people. And within a week, it was international. And, I'd already been working a lot internationally. But it's been 28 years.
Wow. In Georgia.
Yeah, in Georgia.
Does it surprise you at all just being in the South where it's more conservative?
Well, I think that because my sons were just coming into their teen years, um, Hartwell was a safe town to raise them in because I was gone so much. I mean, it was nothing for me to be gone 7, 8 weeks at a time in different countries. I work in 62 countries. And so my sons were in a space where in that town, it's like any small town across the nation. You've either got to bring the world to your children or take your children out into the world, or you're going to have drug issues and pregnancy issues and so forth. But my sons were very accepting of my work. And they answered phones, they dealt with people, and they made appointments. They would, dealt with me getting up in the morning going, I just can't deal with talking to people today. And they're like, crap. And they're having to, call everybody and reschedule. But what I finally became to understand in teaching, helping people become insubstantial without transitioning in that third phase was, how do I help people go out of judgment without having to die to do it? How can we truly move beyond what we personally feel and move into that space? So medical intuitive back in the day, 28 years ago was what fit. I tend to think of myself as a vibrational manipulator. It just doesn't look good on business cards because people are like, what does that mean? But it's been a blessed time these last 28 years.
Sure. How did the community respond, right? Like, obviously word of mouth, right? But there had to be some fear in going down there and like starting a practice and all of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You get a small southern town and in the Bible Belt. And, there were 6 Baptist churches around me, and the Pentecostal church and the Catholic church and the Baptist church right across the street from where I opened my office. And the only training I've ever taken was a weekend course in hypnosis. And back in that day, you could hang your shingle on that, that weekend. And that's what I did. And the Sunday, I was opening on a Monday, that Sunday afternoon, the Baptist minister from across the street came in. And had Hartwell hypnotherapy in big letters out front. He came in, he's like, I just want to welcome you to the community. Glad you're opening things up. And I'm like, okay, well, thanks. And he's like, do you ever go to church? And I said, I really don't. I'm not a weak. I want to go when I want to go. And by the time he and I were done with that talk, he had given me a key to the church and just said, go in when you feel like it.
Wow.
Yeah. Next morning, Monday morning, first person who walks through my door is a man who's the detective with the police force. And he introduces himself as a detective. And I'm like, oh, cripe. And he's like, my son has a stuttering issue. And my wife and I have taken him everywhere. And just a couple of weeks ago, we were saying maybe hypnosis would help him. And here you are. I'd like to make an appointment. So there was never any retaliation or negative feedback. People welcomed me and just it was wonderful. I
Sure.
opened in 1995, and in 2000, when my sons, I had kind of adopted two more sons during those teen years. So I had four boys. So when the last two boys graduated in 2000, I said, hey, guys, you got the house. I'll give it to you for a year. I'm going to move closer to Atlanta so I can get closer to the airport and see ya. And my boys were just like, cool, we'll take it. And so, but they've been my staunchest supporters. They've been awesome.
Sure.
But the town really dealt with it well and kept an eye on him. And I remember specifically when son Matthew was 16 and I was teaching a gig in Ireland, and the vibrations there were so high. I was blind. I couldn't see. The cab driver got me into the hotel, and I had to call out and ask someone to lead me to the receptionist desk because the frequencies were so high that the particles were just going everywhere. I couldn't make out where anything was, if there were stairs, what. And so excuse me, I called Matthew and I said, hey, dude, get your passport, call the principal and tell him you're going to be out of town for a week and have one of your brothers drive you to the airport. And he's like, okay. And of
Sure.
course, he had a blast.
Yeah. He's
But
like, oh man, I got to miss a week of school. Oh,
I know, and I got to be in
shucks.
Ireland to help her.
That
I mean, it
sucks.
sucks. So, the boys have always been incredibly supportive and
Hmm.
in honoring the work and being back there if I need some help.
Sure. So being able to see particles, is that your gift and seeing the ailments that are in your clients?
Yes. Yeah. The particles are definitely it. So, every frequency changes from person to person to person. So some people I hear, some people, the particles will actually change and make words. Sometimes it shows me a movie. The body only knows truth. And so how somebody remembers something, it's important. But if the body's telling me that it's something else, then I stop them and go, whoa, that's not what your body's telling me. Let's back up a little bit and talk about what's really going on.
Hmm.
And so sometimes it can get contentious. And people have always said, you were in my face, but I felt you hugging me the whole time. Because in order to get healthy, you really have to understand what the emotional cause is that created. You don't have to understand the event. That's not important. What you need to understand is the emotion that you've carried. And maybe you've had talk therapy, maybe you've had hypnosis, whatever, and you understand the behavior, but that doesn't clean up from your cells.
So you're kind of using hypnotherapy in that to find the original emotion that's attached to that event?
No, I can pretty much size someone up within a minute. And so we spend 15 minutes talking and I kind of lead their questions. So, I always start out with what's going on personally, professionally, and physically. And they'll tell me, and then I'll go, how's your marriage? And they'll go, great. And their body says no. And I'm like, really? So let's talk about that a little bit more in depth. And I won't tell them that their body's saying no. I'll just
Hmm.
reiterate the question until they're willing or feel safe enough to then start talking about what's really going on in their world.
How do you see that? How does the body communicate that to you?
So, when you're watching television and the cable goes out and you
Hmm.
get the snow,
Hmm.
I'm looking at snow and it's writing, it's talking to me, it is showing me a movie. It will actually go into a movie script and show me what happened. There was a great guy, awesome guy, who had liver cancer, and he, was a guy, who doesn't normally call somebody like me. And he called. He was in stage 4, and I said, "So talk to me about your life." He's like, "It was a life." And I'm like, okay, but like, what happened when you were a kid? He's like, I had a normal childhood. And I'm like, really? So you said you grew up in Chicago. And he said, yeah. And I said, was your dad a member of the mob? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, don't you think the fact that he was killed in front of you when you were 7 years old made an impact in your life? And his body's showing me this movie. And he's like, everybody loses parents.
Hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, but what really ticked you off was it was almost Christmas time. And your dad had brought home all sorts of presents. And when the merchants realized that your dad was dead and he couldn't pay for anything, they came and took all the presents and out of the house, and you had nothing. And he's like, man, that really ticked me off. And I'm like, bingo. Now we got it. Now we're getting somewhere.
Hmm.
Because for him, he had rationalized it as an adult. But when you're a child, that's what's storing in your body, not the understanding as an adult was there was nothing he could do about it at the age of 7. But as a child, he was furious, just
Hmm.
furious. And once he began to understand that, we started to do what I developed color works and tone works and so forth. He was fine. He was
Hmm.
fine. He went from a stage 4 to a stage 0. So, it's not always that way. Sometimes it's, saying to people, no, your bags are packed. And so now how can I help you uh, move to the next stage of crossing? Because then that becomes my job,
Hmm.
not giving them false hope or attempting to save them if the soul and source have already agreed that it's time to go home.
How do you how do you help them in that transition, right? Like, do you since you had guidance throughout your life with the voice, is that your kind of inside, person on the other side that's kind of giving you information for them to kind of calm them down and guide them through this transition?
It's really person to person. I like to make the passing joyful time isn't the right word for it, but to make it exciting to get to know what's going on. The last child that I worked with who passed, who was here in town. I live on a lake and he loves that lake. And so he's like, I want to be in a boat and I want to be like Boromir and I want to be in the Lord of the Rings and I want to go over the waterfalls and go by your house. And his dad was like, frantically making a boat on a piece of paper saying like a boat like this, wasn't that what Boromir was in? And he's like, yeah. And so I'm like, so hold that thought, let's just talk about that. And, when you get, down to my boat, I'll be with you. And so, he was smiling like crazy when he crossed. And, some of the harder ones when, a woman who had been diagnosed with a cancer when she was 3 months pregnant and was on her bladder and they couldn't operate. And by the time she gave birth, it had gone into stage 4 and had gone through her abdomen. And so worked with her for 2 years, got her and her husband to move from New York to Seattle, where his family was. She had no family, where his family was, because at some point he was going to be raising their daughter on his own. And, she called and she said, my kidney's failing. Will you fly out to Seattle and be with me? Sure. So I jumped a flight and I went to Seattle. And, she had been really, really hardcore on the food that she could eat. And she loved food. I mean, that was one of her greatest sacrifices during the whole cancer thing, was not being able to eat the foods that she wanted to eat. And so her first question is, am I going to die? And I said, yeah, within the next 72 hours, you'll be gone. So how do we take it from here? And of course, she and her husband are crying. And so I sat there with them and, we talked about what her belief system was, what his belief system was. And he's like, what's the best way to handle this? And I'm like, crawl in that hospital bed with her. And you guys start telling each other all the funny stories of your relationship and your wedding and all of the fun times that you've had in your lifetime. And they both started giggling and they're like, we can do that. And so as I was getting ready to leave, as I left before she passed, she had called down to the kitchen in the hospital, and she wanted fried chicken, she wanted spaghetti, and she just ordered this huge, huge menu. And her husband's like, "You can't eat those foods." He was reacting to what he's done for the last 2 years. And she looked at him and she's like, "Shut up. I'm dying. I can eat whatever I want."
Sure.
And so, it was a peaceful crossing. And, I still get Christmas cards from him every year and showing their daughter. So, you're not always able to make it so peaceful, but it's the reality of we're going to pass. I'm 65. I thought I'd be dead at 62. I'm still here. I don't know what I'm going to do, from this point forward. But I think that, a beautiful nun had called, Catholic Church, monastery, had stage 4 cancer. And she was crying so hard when she called in. And I'm like, "You need to take a deep breath, stop crying, tell me what's going on." And she's like, "I've got stage 4 cancer. Doctors say that it's less than 6 months." And I'm like, "Okay, so what's the problem with that?" And she paused and she's like, "Well, I'm a nun." And I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, "I still have a lot more work I want to do." And I'm like, "Well, that's admirable." And she told me about the things that she was doing in her work. And I said, "So you followed because you felt that God put you on this path to be a nun. And now all of a sudden you're going to argue with him when he says he wants to bring you home?" And she was just kind of like, "Oh, that's right." And I'm like, "Look, if you live, it's a win. If you die, it's a win. What part of this do you want me to feel bad about?" And she just started hysterically laughing. And she's like, "That's just so true." And she's like, "I just need to get a grip." And I'm like, "You do, follow your faith." And
Follow your
she was
faith.
just so cute.
Sure. Follow your faith.
Follow
Um,
your faith.
what is your faith, right? Like, what's your philosophy on the universe, source, God, Buddha, whatever you want to call that, um, that energy, that source of what I think is everything. I mean, you see in the quantum world, right? So, I mean, you probably see source every day. Like, what is that? What is that for you?
I consider myself a Christian Buddhist, if there is such a thing. Um, and people call constantly saying, "What's your denomination?" I'm like, "Doesn't matter what mine is. It only matters what yours is." And I will follow whatever faith you have. But I think in looking at the universe and being, in touch, um, it's a blessing, it's a curse. You never have time off. That particle time doesn't shut off at 5 o'clock and allow me to, have a good date or have a good, night off and watch. So everything has its blessing and curse. But I heard a male voice. Do I think that source is male? No. I think that you hear the tonal quality of voice in which you most believe and what you trust. I didn't trust females.
Hmm.
And so a female voice coming to me wouldn't have meant anything to me. But the serene male voice to me meant everything. And so where women will say, or men will say, "I just hear a female voice." Well, that has a tendency to push to what you're most comfortable with, that tonal quality. Some people hear music, some people, feel those frequencies. But when I look at source, when I look at the universe per se, it's a it's a it's an infinity. It just goes on forever, but there's always noise coming from it. It's like there's always this buzz. And I remember watching The Green Mile for the
Hmm.
first time, and hearing John Coffey say, there's just never any silence. There's just always a buzz in your ear. And that's just so true. There's always talking. There's always talking. You can't shut it out, whether it's from this planet, whether it's from other planets, whether it's, spatial anomalies, whatever it is. There's going to be a tone to it, and in my world, there's two frequencies that are active frequencies in the world, and that's color and that's tone. And I think that tones created the universe, the galaxies, the infinity of it, and also created what we call source, finally became solid and had this essence of intellect, but didn't have the emotional component.
Hmm.
And I think that we as spirits came to this planet as spiritual beings without a body. And we began developing emotions, and we began developing those lesser emotions of anger and jealousy and hatred and so on. And our bodies began slowing down from this high frequency to this low frequency, becoming dense. And once we became dense, then we created what people term the auric field, because we were out of sync with the universe. And so once we developed the auric field, everything's great. And in the 5,000 years, we've managed to muck it up. And so people are feeling like, how do I get in touch with source? Well, the way you get in touch with source is going deep within yourself and being real and validating who you are as a human being, and not listening to the external chatter of what people think of you, or what their opinion is, whether you agree with it or not. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you continue evolving every day into yourself, making your body a light body. And that doesn't mean going out to a conference and going, well, I'm a light being. No. What have you done to deserve that title? Because none of us are there. And I think that that's what's really important, is understanding that it's a day-to-day travel. People want to be in touch with their soul, and that's important. But when I look at the heart center, I see 5 different layers. I see the heart center. I see the subtle energy layer behind that, which is in science our immune system, but it's truly the energy that we came to this planet with. Beyond that is the soul. That's the piece of the Christ consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, that's sitting there, that's learning emotion, right? It's learning emotion. It has the intelligence, fully connected source, but it's learning intelligence. But beyond that is a deep, dark tunnel. And beyond that is the spark of source. And what most people don't do is they start getting in touch with their soul, which is awesome. Bless you, get there. But you got to go through the darkness to get to the true light of source. And once you become the true light of source, then your job is to pull that back through the tunnel to your soul. And when those two pieces merge, then you ascend. And I think that, for people who go through near-death experiences, what they're really doing is, it's all happening inside the body, that their soul is raising above their body, taking an assessment of things. Most people, when they're talking about near-death experiences, aren't emotional when they're out of their body looking down at their body, right? They're looking, they're
Objective, right?
intellectual. Exactly. And so what happens is then the soul goes running right back through that tunnel and goes to source. And soul and source have this little conversation. Is it time to go? And source goes, did you accomplish everything? And soul goes, nope. It's like, get back in position. Did you accomplish everything? Yeah, got everything done. Okay, bam, out of here. And the soul and the source combine and leave the body.
Wow. That is so interesting. Like, how do we go into that tunnel, right? Like, how do we get into that tunnel and pull back source while we're still in this body?
Yeah, it's really being willing to face our fears and face everything that we think we're not, or everything that we don't think we're good enough at, letting go of judgment and using discernment instead. There can be people that I disagree with, but I don't need to hate them. I don't need to be angry at them. I can use discernment and say, as a soul, love you dearly, but we're not walking the same path. It's cool. It's all right. and walk away from that person, not having to have a justification to walk away from that person, just understanding that you're not in sync. And I think that when people get in toxic relationships, they have to have a justification as to why they're leaving the relationship or their friendship or their job or whatever. And you don't. You need to validate how you feel. And that's getting in that tunnel, going, am I in judgment with them because they don't agree with me? Or is this truly doesn't feel right for me? And it's time for me to move in a different direction.
So it's not like this tunnel going in is not like a one and done. Like you go in and you find this tunnel, you go down to the end of it and you bring back source. It's kind of like a lifelong venture.
It's a
Adventure.
lifelong venture. I tell people, you can't put on the Martian boots and, kind of fly through the tunnel, connect with source and bring it back. We're all challenged every day. And, for people who say, I've been through so much in this lifetime, I don't have to come back. Well, no, you're going through a lot in this lifetime because your soul has a lot to learn. And so if you're in a constant state of emotion or addiction or various other things, your job then is one of two things. Continue on that path because the people who are around you are learning tremendously. If you've ever had a loved one with an addiction, you learn a tremendous amount about addiction. I learned a tremendous amount about alcohol and drug addiction. So, while I may have a shot of whiskey, once in a while, alcohol and drugs, my son told me the first time I lectured in Amsterdam that I was wasted space because I wouldn't smoke pot and I wouldn't partake. And why would my body need to be there? I just laughed at him. But I learned as a child that was not a road that I even wanted to come close to going down or experimenting with. And so, for people who do, that's part of their path. I think the most important thing for people to understand as they're going through their tunnel and connecting with source each little time, you're connecting a tiny bit more. But the reality is, I don't know what your soul path is. I may be able to look in your body and see what's happened to you in your lifetime and have that, 1 minute flashback of everything that's happened in your life. But I don't know what your path is. I don't know what your soul is here to learn. And if I don't know what your soul is here to learn, how can I possibly judge you for the actions that you're doing? And that's a motto that I just stay with all the time. If I don't know what your path is, and I'll never know it, how can I judge you? And people will say, how do I know if I'm on my path? And it's like, there's 10,000 ways from A to Z. Pick your path. But how can you not be on path if you don't know what it is? If you're facing a rough time in your life and you feel like you're stuck, change your path. It's as simple as changing your thought process. Do I still want this goal? Or can I make a trip to the right and then get there? Right? I think that people set their 1, 2, 3 according to their history. They'll set their goals on, this. Well, they're setting it on the history of their life. If it hasn't worked before, what makes you think it's going to work now? So don't make the 1, 2, 3. Set your goal and let your life guide you each day as you make your way to that goal.
That's using your intuition, right? Like
absolutely, which
allowing that to
everyone
guide you.
has.
Everyone has intuition. And
Yeah.
I've heard you say before that the body knows, right? Like, so listening is the intuition in your body. It's not a mental analytical thought, is it? Or is it more so like kind of both?
Yeah, your intuition follows your primary and secondary forms of communication. Okay, so people will want to feel, but if they have sight as their primary form of communication, that's the way their intuition is going to come in. If they have, if they're sight and then say they're kinesthetic second, then they're going to feel their intuition. Maybe they'll hear it. Okay. remembering that when you go through a traumatic incident, your primary and secondary forms always reverse during the incident. So let's say you hear, and that's your primary way of communicating, and sight is second. If you're in a traumatic situation, those two will reverse, and you'll be able to see the accident, but you won't hear it. Where in normal course, you would hear it and then see it. So intuition follows your primary and secondary forms of communication. Your goal is to make all 5 forms of communication into one, because everyone has a different frequency. So if great example, brain surgeon called me. He had L4 cancer of the spine, and he had 4 nodules in the left front quadrant of his brain. And he said, I need to know which one came first in order to treat it. And I just started throwing up. I could taste his cancer. And so I had to say to my body, tell me what this means, because all I can do is throw up. And my body said it began in his spine and metastasized to his brain. So I'm getting this out between the heaves, and he's like, wow, I've got 100 questions. And I'm like, email me. I can't talk to you anymore.
I can't take this anymore.
But people, I remember walking into class and I said, wow, who's got the upset stomach? And somebody said, why don't you protect yourself from that? Upset stomach, it's their upset stomach. It's not mine. And so people get into this illusion. Sounds harsh, but it's what it is. They get into this illusion that they have to protect themselves, right? They have to protect themselves from energies from other people, or, psychic vampires, or, whatever the case is. But the reality is, you're the one creating the reality. And if you recognize there's nothing to fear, then your body doesn't go into fear mode. Right? If, I've flown almost 3 million miles in my career, and people say, how did you stop from getting sick? What'd you do? Like, why would I ever have the thought that I'd get sick? If there's somebody throwing up next to me with the flu on a plane, then they're throwing up because they have the flu, because they have an emotional component they haven't dealt with. I don't need to accept it in my life that, oh my gosh, this person's sick and I'm going to develop it. And so I think that, the whole idea of protection is fear, and it's forgetting every available resource. And that resource is that spark you have inside of you. It's your soul. It's the spark. You are, I love the title of your show, your superior self, because you have all the answers inside of you. And while it's also, nice to, have conversations with people and throw, ideas back and forth and brainstorm, ultimately, you're personally responsible for the choices that you make. Nobody can make you do something that you don't choose to do.
Sure. I think a lot of people question, I know I do, right? We have this incredible spark, right, from source, and we want to connect with that. And once we realize that, once you obtain that little bit of Christ consciousness that I think is starting to pop up more so in society, people want to see big changes in their lives, right? Like, if I'm a part of this huge source of the universe, this incredible power, how come I can't physically change my reality right now, right here in this physical form, right? Like, that's the question, right? And I don't know if it works like that.
That's an awesome question. I really think that, the Big Bang Theory and how sparks developed are one and the same. I think at one point, the consciousness that we call source, the intellectual part, broke off into millions and quadrillions of sparks. And that every sojourn that we were going to have as that now individual soul was contracted in that instant. And I think that where people, they question me a lot on it, of how am I not changing my reality? If I'm in touch with source, then why am I not getting more money? Why am I not changing jobs? Why am I not in the right relationship? And I think it comes back to, it comes in source's time, not in yours. And I think that's where we get confused in terms of our Christ consciousness. People want to belong to the Christ consciousness, but are they truly doing everything in their world to make it so that they're as pure as possible? Because it's not just a saying, it's a going through that tunnel every morning. One of the things that I do at nighttime, and I've done it for 30 years, is before I go to bed at night, I look myself in the mirror. I say, did I live my life today in integrity and honesty? And if my answer is yes, then I can get a good night's sleep and tomorrow starts all over again. I don't get points for having 30 days in a row or 60 days in a row. It's, where was I today? Where was I today? How did I help today? Where did I move today? And that doesn't mean we don't have our own personal lives, because we all have our own souls that we need to continue to move from. I can't tell you how much anger, when I woke up and I was 63, I was furious at God. I'm like, you told me I could come home at 62 if I wanted. The boys and I had long conversations the year that I was 62. And I'm like, I'm ready for my next adventure. I'm ready for my next gig. I'm tired. I got a pink slip waiting saying I want to be on Mars for 1,000,000 years before I reincarnate, before I come back. And so when I woke up at 63, I was furious. And it took me months to work through that I wasn't going to go. And that wasn't a suicidal thing. It was like, oh my gosh, you want me to keep working? I'm tired. What about dating? What about like having a life? And I finally realized that the only person that was keeping me from dating was the fact that I was still a workaholic.
Right?
And I was still working 70, 80-hour weeks because I wanted to help people. And I had to say, you know what? It's okay to put me in after 40 hours. It's okay to say, no, I can't sit up all night with you. No, I can't fly to where you are. It didn't make my work any less. I just allowed myself to become part of the process. And so I think that when we feel like we're in Christ consciousness, it's understanding that we still have that tunnel every day, that none of us are going to be in that spark. I think that there's very few masters walking the earth that fit that. I would put the Dalai Lama as one. But he's even admitted he gets angry. He's still got to go back and forth through that tunnel. So I think there's a misperception of what Christ consciousness means as we as a community, because we hear it a lot, right? If we all just raise our frequencies, then we'll be able to make change. Well, it's the same way your body works. Every cell is an individual and still works as a community. Every cell is independent of itself and it communicates to all the other cells around it. And we're exactly the same way within the Christ consciousness. We're individual and it's up to us to do our work. And in terms of who we are as a soul, not to get people around us to understand, but who am I as a soul? And then my soul can start talking to other souls, but you've also got those other souls that are not in Christ consciousness who have every right to continue their sojourn as much as we continue ours.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
And it's not a battle of good and bad, right? I mean, it's not a battle of who's right and who's wrong. It's a battle of, wow, you're you and you're awesome and you're your superior self. And I don't need to agree with you. You don't need to agree with me. But the soul connection is what's important. And we make it too mental. Mm-hmm. We make it too intellectual, I think.
Sure. I think my philosophy is that everyone should have their own subjective truth, right? Like everyone should basically create their own truth and explore that. And if it's not accurate at the end of the day, like find a different one and continue down that path until you find something that resonates with you. And
Exactly.
the one thing you'll never get rid of is the pain of being a human, right? Human nature.
That's
It's
right.
you have to keep going
That's
through that
right.
pain. And that's what builds that inner strength that you were talking about, that inner knowingness. I think the inner knowingness, the understanding of emotions and how important they are to our human experience is that it allows us to experience the moment fully, right? To be in that moment 100% and to have everything that's associated with that. Now, people tend to disassociate with the moment when they're having traumatic events in their lives, and that's a defense mechanism, that's survival mechanism, and I'm sure you see it all the time in your work, the effects of that. Hypnotherapy has been a tool that people have used to do regression therapy, to go back to the initial event that has triggered that emotion, that stuck energy, and even in past life regression, going back to the original life, that that person may still be carrying that energy in from one life to the next, which I think is fascinating.
Right.
But I think the game here is right with emotion. To your point, I think it's the experience of that, good or bad, however you label that. It's to
However,
feel it 100%. Like if it's the worst feeling in the world, like I mean, the worst, feel it 100% and then release yourself from it.
mhm. Yeah. I call it, I don't know if I can say it on the show or not, bleep me out. But I call it the shit effect. And it's like when something becomes so unbearable in your life, right? And you're just wondering, how did I get to this place? This is awful. This is the most traumatic thing I've ever gone through. You're a spiritual human in transition, and you're going through the most phenomenal growth time. And so when that hits my life, because it does occasionally, all it's none of us are immune from it. The longer it takes, every morning I wake up and I'll be crying and I'm like, this is a really good growth spurt because I've been in this for a long time. And then all of a sudden you wake up and you feel this whoosh, and you know that your soul learned what it needed to learn. And now you're on this next fabulous path. And so I think that it's about not looking at our lives, whether they're good or they're bad or, whatever. I think it's looking at our life and saying, hey, this isn't a good or bad experience. This experience is just that. It's an experience. And it's whatever I choose to make it. Let's go for, if you go outside to watch the sunrise and you don't have the ability to hear or think or speak or smell, all you can do is see. It's your words that make that a phenomenal sunrise this morning. Or, gosh, why did I get out of bed? Because I couldn't even see it this morning. The reality is, a sunrise is simply a sunrise. It has no meaning to it. It's the meaning you choose to give it. And I think that goes throughout our lifetime of we give meaning to the event. And once we understand we give meaning to the event, then we can go back and look at things that happened in our past that weren't so awesome and understand what positive growth came from going through that experience. Because good always comes out of bad. I've never, 100,000 people, I've never seen it not be that way. Good will always come out of bad. And so you take personal responsibility and go back to that event and understand what you learned and how you grew. Maybe it was, I'll never do that again. And maybe it was, wow, that really put me on a different trajectory. I love this wonderful woman that I worked with a few years ago, was really having issues with her mom, and they had had issues their entire life. And so I gave her some suggestions of how she could view her upbringing differently. And she started thinking about them and going through them. And her mom was coming through town to visit. Was coming through town and decided to stop and visit, which was the first time in 10 years that they had been physically together. Before that, it was all toxic. So she started looking at her life differently, what she learned from her mother, given her circumstances. And they got a hotel And she said they just sat and drank wine and laughed and like had this beautiful night. And she woke up in the morning and she opened up in the curtains and she's like, come on, Mom, it's time to get up. And her mom had passed during the night. And she's like, how can I get rid of this trauma? And I'm like, what a blessing. What an honor that she chose you to be with when she crossed, that she felt that much trust, soul to soul with you, to be with you, to honor you with that. And that was it. It was no
That's
longer this traumatic thing.
that's our most vulnerable. That's our most vulnerable state, right? Is our
Yeah,
death.
is our death. And she chose her daughter to be with. I mean, I just think that, for me it was amazing. I mean, I had tears of joy that they had been able to have that night and just have a fabulous time. The daughter had already shifted a lot of how she felt about her mother. And it was a beautiful thing. And so, while yes, cry, that's okay, but also understand the significance of what took place. You're still going to go through your grief stages, but they don't have to be traumatic grief stages.
Hmm.
They can be neutral grief stages.
Hmm. I could talk to you all night, Patty. Jeez Louise. This has been fantastic. How can people find more about you? What can they go? Website or Instagram, YouTube?
All of it, patticonklin.com. I also have a channel on Roku and Apple TV and all of that stuff. If you're on streaming networks, you can find a lot of my shows there. But patticonklin.com, and just giving the office a call, and I'm still working. So
Patty, this has been awesome. I love it. You got to come back, girl.
I would love to be back. I love the questions and the aspect of your show, because I watched a few little tidbits on different people that I knew who have been on your show, and I just love your interviewing style. So kudos to you.